first session of the day with Marc Mulholland presenting Atomic Revolution, More Water Resource and Landlordism. Before that, I will be continuing his reading of Landlordism, Landlordism version of the Communist Manifesto. Take it away.
Thank you. Indeed, what are to us the aqueducts of Rome, the pyramids, what are crusade, and what even the great migration of peoples to us who have seen the titanic buildings and expeditions made by this all-upsetting class that always and wherever it breathless reaches replaces what it created, living on upset. Without pausing, it alters machines and all products. Formerly unimagined forces, it hauls from air and water, creates new materials never seen on this planet. Thrice in one generation, it changes the cloth of one's clothes. The hold of knife and fork frequently alters its feel in the hand, and the eye is always faced with new formations. So too are people changed. Peasants are into factories driven. Craftsmen driven in droves to new savage shores. Villages shoot up, and cities where this class digs for ore, dead and unpeopled in a flash when it moves away. So quick a boom was never seen before, nor so quick a bust. Retaining unaltered the way of production was always the first business of the classes that rule. This class is the first that erects the upset as the sine qua non of society, building its buildings on permanently quaking soil, fearing nothing so badly as rusting and moss. It enforces daily change on the force of existing relations, all that was stable habit. The steady and solid is pulled down, the sacred desecrated, and people stand unsafe. The earth rolling beneath their feet, finally forced to examine their living with sober sight. And all of this happens not in one country or two, for an unquenchable urge to sell off the bulging commodities ceaselessly drives the bourgeois class across the whole worldwide expanse of the earth. It must everywhere look around, build upon, settle in, everywhere tie the sticky threads. It makes consumption and production cosmopolitan. It is at home everywhere and nowhere. It destroys the rich crafts and indigenous arts and fetches its raw materials from furthest off places. Its factories service fashions and needs brought forth by the most diverse climates. High amid clouds, the feverish commodities climb up the mountain pass. They trample on rotting toll bars that have stood for 1,000 years. Their password is capital letters, cheap! Exclamation mark. And who are the white-bearded geezers there? Priests come to curse the blasphemers, not a chance. They are buyers, and those walls there, never conquered. The agents smile, and with bales of lightest calico batter soundlessly down the Chinese walls. Mountains make way, islands regroup, peoples start needing each other. Spiritual wealth, too, becomes a commonwealth of spirit. The Roman scholar avidly reads a formula from Poland. Lines penned by an English hand are completed by a Japanese hand, and together scholars all over the world design an image of the world. literatures of various peoples become the world's literature.
Minutes, sounds good, yeah. Thank you, comrades, for having me at Communist University again, speaking on how to make a revolution in reference to the land war. The title is stolen from Raymond Postgate, who was, back in the day, as a student at Oxford University. He was from a leftist position. He was a conscientious objector in the First World War, got sent down, got beaten up by pro-war students and then sent down by his college, so he never completed his Oxford degree. Was a founder member of the Communist Party in Britain, editor of their newspaper, left quite early, and was in the left wing of the Labour Party thereafter, kind of amanuensis to George Lansbury in the 1930s. With his brother-in-law, he wrote G.T.H. Cole, he wrote The Common People, which is still a fantastic history of the labour movement broadly since the 18th century in Britain. It's still very well worth reading. G.T.H. Cole is a great researcher, but not a particularly good writer. Postgate was a wonderful writer. But he wrote a lot of material about revolutionary movements internationally. He wrote the Bolshevik Theory, one of his earliest books, which was praised by Lenin as a good account of what Bolshevism meant for a British audience. He wrote books like revolutionary biographies. But he wrote one book in 1934, which is How to Make a Revolution, which is fundamentally looking at a Marxism, a syndicalism, and kind of a Bakuninist or kind of let's see, we would think of Blanco, kind of the revolutionary group-less approach to achieving revolution. So it's an interesting book worth looking at. So the title is partly inspired by that, How to Make a Revolution, and it's partly because I think in the Marxist tradition one tends to think of the party as a revolutionary party, but not a party which makes revolution. As Kautsky famously puts it. But there are elements, of course, to making a revolution, particularly cadre building, particularly organisation, strategy and tactics. Other kind of inspiration, I suppose, or what got me thinking about this particular application of the topic is something which is close to the heart, I think, of Weekly Worker and CPGB, which is the notion of the snowball effect, the idea that when you get smallish groups coalescing and combining together, you get more. It's more than an additive process, that you kind of get a qualitative leap, that the coming together of forces can actually push forward and develop a revolutionary organisation in a way which is more than simply those forces which come together. And I think this, whatever we may think of that, and it might be worth part of the discussion, as a general theory, I think it's something which applies quite well to the Irish example. One must defend the land revolution, the land war, as indeed a revolution. I think it kind of is a revolution. There's quite a lot written about it, mostly from a very conservative position, and conservative historiography is that the great mass of people aren't particularly interested in politics, and politics, this goes back to David Hume really, politics is a kind of a necessary shibboleth, which is best done as the kind of semi-private entertainment of elites. Mass politics is always dysfunctional and always irrational, because the natural habitus for humans is the private and the personal and the small group. So politics should be private and personal and small group. It should be an aristocratic or political class kind of a pursuit. If you try to make mass politics, it always ends up being radically dysfunctional, because it's not the habitus in which people normally live. So a kind of conservative historiography, Max used the term the Tory view of history, is that what people really want to do is live quiet private lives, and therefore mass politics is always dysfunctional and always unpleasant. So this is one conservative critique of mass politics in Ireland, including the land war. The other conservative critique is that ideals are never realised, and things, mass political action will always be, first of all, unnecessary. In the Irish example, landlordism would have disappeared anyway, and unpleasant, that it leads to a worse outcome than would have been the case. These arguments have been made. It's always difficult to argue against a counterfactual. Landlordism would have disappeared anyway. I suspect landlordism would have disappeared in Ireland anyway, but it probably would have ended sometime during the War of Independence, and it would have meant far more people dying. There would have been landlords strung up from trees in the War of Independence. There would have been a very, very severe social and physical shock. The land war, in that sense, does see deaths, as we look at a bit later on, but probably much less deaths than there would have been otherwise. The argument that it makes for worse society. This is very dominant, and quite dominant amongst youthful academia in Ireland at the minute. Irish kind of radical liberal historiography will talk about Ireland before the 1980s, independent Ireland, kind of like it would have been living in Salazar's Portugal. There's a drastic, in my view, exaggeration of the ultra-conservative nature of Irish society. And what it has done is undermine the Ireland which was built by the land war revolution. I will come back to that a bit towards the end of the paper. And I don't want to deny the conservatism which did exist in Irish society, but I think now it's greatly overstated by a kind of radical liberal historiography, as well as a more traditional conservative revisionist historiography. On whether the land war should be seen as a revolution, it seems to me just beyond doubt. It ticks all the boxes. There is mass political activity. Much of this goes beyond the law. It is directed towards the overthrow of a social system, which is landlordism, and that social system is overthrown. So I struggle to see how it's not a revolution, but if anybody wants to make the argument in discussion, I'd be very content to hear it. But it seems to be odd that it's not discussed in these terms. I've been sceptical in another place about how much the War of Independence should be seen as a revolution, but I think there's no doubt really about the land war. It's a social revolution. Okay. So emphasis of this talk is about the assemblage of resources, of organisational social resources, which brings a revolution about. But of course you need kind of predispositions. One thing which you find in Ireland is a powerful, long-enduring peasant nationalism. And there may be a certain controversy in describing it as such, because the general view of nationalism, and again there's something that might be worth chatting about a bit, is that nationalism is something which kind of begins amongst the educated intellectuals. Nationalism is then taken over by state builders. It becomes an ideology of state construction in the 19th century. Nationalism as a mass phenomenon is primarily borrowed through society by the state. This is generally how historians and theorists now look at nationalism. Begins with the small egg-headed elite in universities and people like the Brothers Grimm and so on. It is taken up by state builders, usually in quite a conservative way, and then they pump it into people's heads through the school system and through railways and so on. Ireland has always very badly fitted into this category, partly because kind of intellectual nationalism in the classical mould. You can find it in 1840s Ireland with the emergence of the Young Ireland movement, but it clearly postdates mass Irish nationalism, which is obviously and radically discernible in the 1790s, and indeed predates that. I think nationalism is always and everywhere as a phenomenon, it's a class collaborationist phenomenon. Nationalism is about how class differences are secondary to the differences which, secondary to the solidarity which is owed between the classes within a particular territory. So nationalism, is why Marxists are not too happy about it. Nationalism is always and everywhere a class collaborationist phenomenon. Usually nationalism is dominated by middle classes or upper classes, and they're imposing a particular kind of domination from below. But there's a popular nationalist element which is placing a claim of responsibility upon the upper classes, upon the bourgeoisie or the landed elite, that they are owed solidarity with these upper classes. So you get a popular nationalism which is class collaborationist, but there's also one which is bottom up. And I think we can see that in Ireland. It gets more complicated if we think about, let's say, the nationalism of the Vietnamese peasantry, which is the driver of the communist revolution there, or communistic revolution there. So it can get very complicated, but broadly speaking, that's what I say about nationalism. But nationalism can be from bottom up, and it can be a peasant phenomenon. In a way, a good Ireland comparator, which isn't often made but is worth thinking about, is Serbia. It's a picture of some Serbians from the first Serbian War of Independence. What you have in Ireland, what you have in Serbia is the conquest of Serbia by the Ottomans, which means you have a Catholic peasantry dominated by a Muslim landed elite and political elite, and there's no friendship between them at all. There isn't a kind of solidaristic basis, or there isn't a collaborationist basis between the peasantry and the ruling elites in that country. Serbia's conquest had destroyed its own native aristocracy, leaving a largely illiterate Orthodox peasantry ruled by a Muslim military elite. Leadership in the War of Independence, there emerged some figures such as returning Serbian officers who'd served in the Austrian army, and notably pork dealers. Pork dealers are quite significant in early Serbian nationalism. When there's a bit of civil war between Muslim rulers, Serbian peasants, particularly the swineherds of Samaradja, rebelled and captured Belgrade in 1805. It's a long-term process. The international powers get involved, but Serbia, at least a chunk of Serbia, does become effectively independent in the 1820s. And this is a peasant nationalism primarily. In essence, Serbian independence emerged as a peasant-based national movement in which leaders are drawn from ordinary commercial and military backgrounds, gradually displaced an alien ruling elite and creating an autonomous state. Now, there's a lot of comparators in Ireland, I think. In Ireland, Ireland had been conquered, and it's not just a political and military conquest, but in the Tudor period, it's a social conquest, the disintegration of the landholding patterns in Ireland. What you usually have is that feudalism and post-feudalism in the countryside complicates relations. The peasantry normally is extremely stratified. Copyhold and leasehold and so on. It means that there's a whole complex of customary relations mediating between the peasantry and the landed elite, which means it's quite easy to stratify the peasantry because you've got different layers of the peasantry depending upon what customary rights, what customary privileges they may have in their relations with the landlord class. In Ireland, however, due to the conquest, you don't have customary rights because the conquest just wipes out customary rights, which means that in effect the peasant class is made uniform by the conquest. During the 9 Years' War of 1594 to 1603, a kind of what comes close to an Irish national rising is destroyed. Gaelic society is largely destroyed as an organised form. And plantation happens in Ulster, that is settlement and other parts of Ireland. Crucially, the Attorney General, Sir John Davis, argues that the Gaelic system of landholding was now illegitimate, therefore conferred no legally valid hereditary rights. Tanistry and gavelkind, the kind of basis of the Gaelic social order, were declared simply unlawful. English law, therefore, without any customary rights attending to it, completely supersedes Gaelic customary rights. And this has profound long-term social consequences. Conquest effectively stripped the Irish peasantry of customary land rights, where elsewhere in Europe they were protected and they differentiated the tenantry. Whereas, take an example, in England, the enclosure of the lands is a kind of drawn-out process in the 18th century and requires numerous specific acts of Parliament to carry it out, because customary rights have to be overridden by acts of Parliament. Basically, enclosure, insofar as it happens in Ireland, happens almost completely silently. There's no acts of Parliament, there's very little hullabaloo about it, because the rights of the landlords are simply straightforwardly superior to the rights of any peasant. So the peasantry are unusually homogenous, legally and socially, apart from the one big obvious exception, which is the Protestant-Catholic divide, which in turn maps on to the native-settler divide. If we look at the political consciousness of the Irish peasantry, from very early on, it's complex and shifting. It includes things like Jacobitism, sectarianism, democratic radicalism, republicanism, intense localism, all kinds of different things. And therefore people tend to say it's not real nationalism because it's unsophisticated. I think it is pretty sophisticated. It's complicated and contradictory, but that's what sophisticated normally means. It's unsophisticated because it's largely an unwritten political consciousness, and therefore you can't write learned monographs about it based upon elevated works. But it's pretty clear to me that we are describing a form of nationalism, a radical opposition to English as foreign rule in Ireland, which is consistent. Insofar as it is contradictory, of course, it's no more contradictory than middle-class nationalism in Ireland, which of course goes all the way from a Catholic home rule, moderate home rule, all the way to Republican separatism. Opposition to foreign rule amongst the masses in Ireland was the peasant masses was more or less a constant. The peasantry were the main driver, or the main forces of the United Irishmen revolutionary movement of the 1790s, though it's the bourgeois element of that movement tends to attract more attention. 1798 rebellion itself, as far as I can tell, is overwhelmingly a peasant revolution. This is just an image from 1798. This is the peasantry bursting into New Ross, the Battle of New Ross. This is the famous image of one kind of peasant guy who goes up and sticks his hand in the cannon of the yeomanry, saying, "The cannon is blocked, boys, attack." What happens next is the guy fires the cannon and he's blown to smithereens. I'm afraid the cannon wasn't blocked, but it's a famous image. The largest division in the peasantry, of course, is between native Catholic and settler Protestant. This had mostly faded by the 19th century in the south and west of the country. Here the division had crystallised between a native, largely Catholic peasantry and a Protestant settler landed elite. In Ulster, however, there was a Protestant peasantry which persisted and was settler in origin, but not straightforwardly assimilated to the British state because a great number of them, small majority, the Protestant peasantry or the Protestants in Ulster were Presbyterian. And of course, the Crown is not straightforwardly Presbyterian in Britain, it's Anglican. Presbyterian Ulster, Protestant Ulster, peasant Ulster was peasant Presbyterian Ulster was probably the most radical European peasantry in the 1790s anywhere in Europe. It never overcame its disdain for the Catholic majority in the country, however, and in the first decades of the 19th century, I think partly due to the decline, temporary as it turned out, of the linen industry, and the rise, temporary as it turned out, of cotton, you can see a kind of social basis for a divergence between the Ulster Protestant peasantry and the peasantry in the rest of Ireland. Partly because the peasantry in the rest of Ireland are fundamentally rooted in the production of the soil in Ireland. Increasingly, you get a peasant / urban / artisanal a class in Ulster, which is reliant much more on cotton imports, and as such much more reliant upon integrated within a British and a British orientated international economy. The growth of cotton manufacturing in the 1780s in Ulster reduced their workers' dependence on the land and encouraged the incipient emergence of a manufacturing proletariat. But this did distance them from a mass nationalist movement in Ireland, which was rooted primarily in a peasant society. So I don't want to have an excessively economistic basis for the consciousness of Ulster Protestantism, but I think that is an economic factor. The divergence will become stronger economically later, particularly from the 1860s. American Civil War has a big impact on Ulster because it massively disrupts British cotton supplies and created a major opportunity for Ulster's linen industry, which then just becomes massive, and accelerates Belfast and the Lagan Valley's industrialisation in a way which makes Ulster a major centre of industry in the world in the 1860s and afterwards. So the growing divide between Protestant Ulster and the rest of Ireland was not simply religious or political, though it was largely, substantially that. It also reflected the different class structures and patterns of economic development, increasingly an industrial Ulster versus a predominantly peasant Ireland. Orangism was the main political expression of Protestant peasant militancy, though until the 1880s at any rate, Presbyterians tended to hold rather aloof. Otherwise in Ireland, the peasantry is broadly unified. It had a small farmer core and a craft ancillary, which made up about 1/5 to 1/4 of the total. Partly because of this, I've tended to talk about the peasantry as a social formation, which I know is not good Marxism because Marx meant something else by social formation. But what I kind of drive at is, in some respects, it's a class made up of class fractions. Yes, pure agriculturalists, but we have to be very conscious that a proper peasantry has, and this is the same in virtually any country, about 1/4 of a peasantry will not be primarily agriculturalists, but will be primarily craft workers, woodwork, construction of carts and so on, a blacksmith, whitesmith, all the rest of it. Market towns in Ireland were small and radically integrated within the rural hinterlands. You don't really have that strong rural-urban divide outside Ulster and outside Dublin and the rest of Leinster. A good deal of labour was organised through the family or by swaps between neighbours, so that it meant that purely wage-earning agricultural labouring class was much smaller in Ireland than it was in Britain, much smaller. To some extent, there isn't really a permanent, consistent, cohesive wage-earning labouring class in Ireland, I think, until really the 1890s. So whilst in England you have the classic Ricardian trinity, which is taken over by Marx, where the landlord provides fixed capital in the form of a working farmstead. The farmer, the tenant farmer, provides working capital to run a farm to make a profit, and then you have wage labour, which actually does the work on the farm. That's a classic trinity with which Ricardo opens his famous book. In Ireland, however, it's a binary. In Ireland, you have landlords who provide very little in the way of working capital. They simply rent out land, which is fundamentally bare, and they receive rent, but they don't provide work, they don't provide fixed capital in any serious sense. And on the other hand, you have a peasantry of small farmers and ancillaries. You don't really have a substantial wage earning element. Before the famine, you had middlemen who were large tenants who had sublet. These middlemen had always been identified with the landlord interest. They more or less disappear before the famine and during the famine. After the famine, you have large graziers, big cattle farms. Again, these are, formally speaking, they're tenants of the landlords, but they are seen to be identified with the landlord interest. They are not seen as part of the peasantry, certainly not by the peasantry itself. So I think fundamentally you have a binary, a landlords and their allies against the peasantry and their allies. And we have three broad oppositional currents in this society. Here next. First, we have the electoral parliamentary movement, which is worth bearing in mind. In many respects, this kind of thing is pioneered in Ireland, which is mass electoral orientated politics. In the 18th century, early 19th century, and for much of Europe towards the end, until the rise of socialist parties, electoral politics is an affair of small clubs. Ireland is a novelty, really, in the 1820s because of the emergence through O'Connell's movement, first for a civil rights movement, Catholic emancipation, and then a campaign for repeal of the Union, develops an electoralism which has a mass basis, which is based upon mass demonstration, mass political organisation, primarily in the countryside, but also in the urban areas, and uses Parliament as a tribune to speak to the masses. And Daniel O'Connell, who's not much loved in the left these days, because he didn't like the trade unions, but is an interesting figure. He's a past master of this kind of politics. And in many respects is a genuine radical. He's pretty thorough, a Democrat, never visits America because of his opposition to slavery. He's a sincere Catholic, but he's unquestionably not just a liberal, he's a radical in the genuine sense in the 1830s and the 1840s. So Daniel O'Connell pioneers this kind of mass politics. Partly deliberately, the electorate in Ireland is deliberately suppressed and undercut. It's radically reduced in size in the early 1830s, and until 1884, the electorate in Ireland is deliberately kept much more exclusive than it is in England, much more exclusive, in an attempt to undercut this electoral politics, this mass electoral politics, and to a considerable extent this is successful in Ireland. It's difficult to get an electoralism which maintains mass roots. O'Connellism peters out partly because of the decline and death of Daniel O'Connell, and his son John O'Connell is not very impressive compared to his dad. You have the Independent Irish Party of the 1850s, which, interestingly, does briefly develop a mass basis through the tenant right leagues, but it's basically kind of exhausted and sucked up by the parliamentary system. Sadler and Keogh become kind of demonised, rightly so, demonised names in Irish historiography, because they go to Westminster talking about the independence of the Irish Parliamentary Party, and they end up taking junior government positions. The success, insofar as there is success of mass electoral politics in Ireland, is always based upon a radical disloyalty to the British state. That is, you don't go to Westminster in order to be a loyal opposition, you go to Westminster to be a disloyal opposition. And this, of course, is relatively easy for when you have Irish nationalism on a mass basis behind you, because in effect you are, by definition, opposed to the state which exists. But electoralism, Westminsteralism, has its normal effect of assimilation, of domestication, and this tends to happen when there isn't a mass movement behind that electoralism to discipline the electoral representatives. Second, of course, you have the outright revolutionary separatist movement, which is the Fenian movement. Or sorry, that's Daniel O'Connell there, and beside him is Isaac Butt, who kind of, to a degree, begins to revive constitutional electoralism in the 1870s with the election of a bunch of Home Rule, as they're known, MPs in the 1874, and the emergence of a Home Rule party led by Isaac Butt, who's an ex-Tory, but becomes a Home Rule nationalist. He's a genial old cove, kind of nice guy, quite talented in many respects, but limited in his political authority because he is a great gambler and quite a drinker with lots of affairs. So he had to keep on stopping doing political work because he had debts to pay off and that kind of thing. The other traditional oppositional movement, of course, is revolutionary separatist nationalism, which doesn't have a terribly coherent social movement, though this is often overstated in literature. Fenianism clearly is against landlordism. It does want to see the elimination of landlordism. So the argument that there's no social aspect to Fenianism is rather overdone. Just need to read his newspapers and you see, actually, no, they're opposed to landlordism. But they're a revolutionary democratic movement and a republican movement, which is pretty striking in some respects at their high point in the 1860s, because republicanism is not seen as a terribly successful political form at this time. It leads to civil war in America, it seems. You get kind of tin pot dictatorships in South America, which is the great land of republicanism. You've had two republics in France and they've radically failed, So it is interesting and notable that Fenianism does adopt democratic republicanism as opposed to kind of adhering to a constitutional monarchism, which is the line of O'Connellite repealism and the Home Rulers. They're militarist in that their idea is to have one day there'll be a big insurrection. So they don't think in terms of guerrilla warfare, which hasn't really been invented yet. They think in terms of mass insurrection. They're conscious of the difficulties of doing this. The Irish population is declining in absolute terms, which is basically unique in Europe in the 19th century, and even more so in relative terms to Great Britain. So Ireland's military potential is in permanent decline. Up until the famine, Irish population is about 1/3 of the population of the United Kingdom. This is no longer the case. Also, as Fenian points out in the 1880s and saying, look, we have to be realistic here. There's about 5 million Irish people, 1.5 million of them are Protestant and basically in favour of the Union, but about 500,000 of Catholics are basically Castle Catholics, so you can't rely upon. So we don't have overwhelming resources for a revolution. So basically the Fenians kind of sensibly enough look for international complications to bring about a revolution. They get very excited during the American Civil War because they hope that the Brits will take the side of the southern states, the Americans will go to war with Britain, and the Americans will, in fighting a war with Britain, will land an expeditionary force in Ireland and spark off, help out a Fenian insurrection there. It's not an impossible theory, and indeed England's difficulty being Ireland's opportunity will be an important factor behind 1916. Which in many respects, 1916 is a Fenian rebellion, though it's more complicated than that, but in many respects it's a Fenian rebellion. In the end, they do go for a rebellion in 1867, not because they think it will work, but they feel that if you talk the talk, at some point you have to walk the walk. The rising itself is a damp squib, but what it does do is that it preserves the moral authority of the Fenian movement. Fenian movement reached maybe about 60,000 members in the 1860s, declines very radically from that high point. It will continue to, I think, in 1922. At times it will be very tenuous indeed. At times the Fenian movement, within Ireland itself at least, will be extremely tenuous. You could probably get the really active people into a room this size at certain points, But what you do have is a continuous tradition. And also we have a tradition of illegality, organisation, and basically a factory for cadre building. So what the Fenian revolutionary movement does is build cadre. Many of these cadre go on to get involved in other movements, and maybe Fenianism is often seen as a young person's game. You will often become more sensible and get involved in something else. But they train people. They train people in serious political activity. They train people in a suitable disregard for the majesty of law. They train people in mass political organisation, or in extra-constitutional mass political organisation. And third was what I call the Buchalai, comes under very many names: Rory of the Hills, the Hillside Men, Ribbon Men, Chariots, Right Boys, Defenders, Moonlighters, so on and so forth. This, in some respects, is a generic, organic movement of the Irish peasantry, which is always political to a greater or lesser degree, always clearly radically opposed to foreign rule, but is mostly engaged in the nitty-gritty of struggle with the landed elite. Now, if you think about strikes in this period, I think how can people afford to go on strike in the 19th century, early 20th century? Very often, the reason you can go on strike is that, in a way, a strike is not so much you leave a workplace and then just sit at home for 3 months waiting to win the strike. What you do is you leave a workplace and you go and get a job somewhere else. A strike in the late 20th century is, in many respects, a boycott of a particular employer. This is why you see in the late 19th, early 20th century the phenomenon of the employer lockout, because what a lockout is an attempt to prevent strikers being employed by other capitalists. So this is why strikes are kind of viable in the late 19th, early 20th century, because in fact you can get through a strike period simply by going to work somewhere else. It's much more difficult now, actually. This is one of the reasons why strikes are less viable these days, because you can't really do that in the same way anymore for kind of legal and organisational reasons, and also you've got something more to lose as a mortgage or whatever. But in the peasantry, the situation's rather different, because if you get evicted, you're evicted, you will starve or you'll emigrate, so the struggle tends to be much more absolute. And therefore, the form of struggle is much more absolute. Sabotage and violence and intimidation sabotage, at least implied violence and intimidation is always part of any strike, actually to a degree, but it's much more intense, much more real when you look at the peasant movement, much more present and physical, and the Buchalai organised this. So the Buchalai, to some degree, are like trade unions for a peasantry, but much more, but tend to be more overtly political, usually, and much more likely to use kind of coercion. Coercion is essentially used occasionally against landlords and their agents, but that's difficult and dangerous, it'll get you hanged pretty quickly. Much more often used against social scabs, that is, people who take over the tenancy of a farm from which somebody has been evicted. Easiest way to get yourself murdered in Ireland is to take over the farm of there's some moonlighters there, intimidation, nearly fell off my seat. Easiest way to get yourself murdered in Ireland by the Buchalai is to take over the farm from a widow. If you do that, dead man. So these are the three kind of tendencies which exist in Ireland. Mass electoralism, which at least has a capability to be an electoralism which is radically disloyal to the state. Fenianism, which is rejects electoralism, at least in theory rejects electoralism of any sort, is entirely militaristic, but is primarily a cadre building movement. And then you have the Buchalai, the kind of organic movements of the peasantry. These movements will crisscross at times. They relate to one another, for sure, but they don't coalesce in any consistent way until the Land War. Now, the idea of coalescence is something which had been considered before. James Fenton Lawler, this guy on the stamp here, it's one very gratifying thing about Ireland, is here you get stamps if you're lucky of Princess Diana or whatever on your stamps. Weekly worker comes along to the post to me, just covered in stamps. I don't know where you get them from, and it's all inventors or pioneer women or something like that, or Paddington, whatever, So I cut them out and give them to my reform voting father-in-law because he likes stamps, But in Ireland, you get pictures of revolutionaries as well as more coy things. But Fenton Lawler did to some degree theorise a linkage of these forces in 1848. He talked about the necessity of linking repeal, that is the mass electoralist movement, to something else, to some question which will carry it along like a railway carriage attached to an engine. Of course, in 1848, it's kind of cutting-edge metaphor to make. The land question, he said, was the one ready prepared, self-acting engine if once the fire be kindled. So to some extent, Fenton Lawler is trying to theorise this coalescence to a degree in 1848. He's largely forgotten about in the years succeeding, but he's kind of taken up again more in retrospect as a kind of intellectual pioneer of the coalescence. Much more important and practical in all of this is this guy, Michael Davitt. Michael Davitt is the son of Mayo peasants. Mayo is in the far west of Ireland. His family had been evicted by the landlords in what was known as the years of extermination during and after the famine. He remembers going to the workhouse. The family goes to the workhouse. Of course, when you get to the workhouse, the family's divided up. The kids can't stay with the parents. And he remembers the mother just refusing to go into the workhouse. So instead they go into the emigrant ship, which of course is very satisfactory for the state and the landlords at the time. And they go to England. So Michael Davitt, his whole life, had an English accent. He goes to manufacturing town in Lancashire. He's a boy labourer. He catches his right arm in machinery, and it's torn off. As you can see, he's got one arm. He has to learn to write with his left arm. Whilst he's in England at the time, not dissimilar to now, but at the time of a radical disruption of the solidarity of the British labour movement and the British working class, partly because of mass Irish immigration. So there's a great deal of antagonism to Irish immigrants, and this is a major factor in the de-radicalisation of the British working class after Chartism. Young Davitt gets involved in defending a local area from English anti-Catholic attacks. He joins the Fenian movement in its British organisation in 1865. He's involved in an attempted raid on Chester Castle, an arms raid, which doesn't come off. He's quite a leading figure in the Fenian movement. He's finally arrested and does hard time in Dartmoor as a Fenian. 1877, he gets out on ticket of leave. This is Communist University, but of course the classic university for revolutionaries is always prison. So he done a lot of reading and a lot of thinking whilst he's in prison. And when he comes out, he is beginning to think about how do we get Fenianism involved in a wider social movement to give it some heft and some pull. So he comes out, he goes to he gets active in the Fenian organisation again, first in London, but there it almost entirely dwindled away. And then he tours Ireland and he finds a pretty enthusiastic popular reception. Going through country areas in particular, bonfires had been lit in the fields, lit in the mountain hillsides to celebrate the return of Davitt. And then Davitt, there's a considerable Fenian organisation in America. Michael Davitt visits the United States in 1878, and this marks a decisive turning point in Irish nationalism. He found most Irish Americans pretty apathetic apolitically, but he did find an organised, small but organised and disciplined Fenian movement. And over there in particular, he meets with this guy here, the one who's got two arms, which is John Devoy. And John Devoy, as a young man, had been in Ireland. He'd been imprisoned for Fenian activities. He ends up going to America, where he's an indomitable Fenian organiser, will remain an indomitable. He is just the ultimate Fenian. He'll eventually die in 1928. He just never gives up, never stops. He's a major American side organiser in 1916, you know. But John Devoy links up with David at this time. And they discuss how one might attempt some coalescence between Fenians, the radical end of the Home Rule constitutional nationalist movement, and the social question. Speeches at Brooklyn and Boston, David talks about an agitation that must appeal to the selfishness which is invariably the mainspring of human actions. The selfishness that is invariably the mainspring of human actions, what we would call class consciousness. While distinguishing, and he is already beginning to look to one element of the Irish Parliamentary Party led by Isaac Butt. Most of them are pretty milk and water, but it does have a radical fringe of radical parliamentarians, and one of these guys who is coming to the attention of the Fenians is Charles Stewart Parnell. Parnell was born in 1846 in Avondale, County Wicklow, into a long-established Protestant landed family. His political inheritance combines an anti-union tradition. His great-grandfather, as a member of the Irish Parliament, had opposed the Act of Union, with strong anti-English sentiments, which he had inherited in part from his American mother. He'd also been a student at Cambridge, and it really put him off England. I don't know, maybe too much woke education or something, but he didn't much like Cambridge. There's a great deal of effort put into establishing Parnell as fundamentally a kind of conservative kind of guy, you know, and I think it really doesn't fly with Parnell. Parnell is, in most important respects, a radical. It's a kind of radicalism which to some extent owes itself to radical Toryism, which is a real phenomenon in the 19th century. It certainly had been. You know, you get a kind of radical Toryism which is virtually Chartist in the 1830s, you know, and he kind of owes to that kind of radical. He's not a Tory because he's too radically anti-English for that. But I think the attempts of people like Lord Bute and so on, good historical writing, but I think the attempt to make Parnell a kind of misconceived moderate is just not right, you know. Parnell, there is a famous the Manchester Martyrs case, which is some Fenian bombers in England in the 1860s had been arrested. There's an attempt to rescue the Fenian bombers by other Fenians, and they go up onto they go to the police kind of cart which has taken them off and blow the lock off in order to rescue the Fenians inside. But when they blow the lock off, a bullet goes through and kills one of the guards. And so this happens in Manchester. The Fenians who've done this are arrested and they're hanged. It's the last public hanging in England. And they're hanged before a kind of baying crowd. They're known in Ireland as the Manchester Martyrs. But a very famous case when Parnell goes into Parliament and one of the ministers of Crown talks about these Fenian murderers in Manchester, and Parnell famously says there was no murder committed in Manchester, which of course is a solidaristic statement for the Fenians. He left Cambridge in 1869 without a degree, entered politics, elected MP for Meath in 1875 as a supporter of Isaac Butt's moderate Home Rule movement. But in many ways, he's a radical within this movement. By 1878, he won control of the Home Rule Federation of Great Britain. which is the Home Rule organisation in Great Britain, but we have to remember is the Home Rule Federation in Great Britain was controlled behind the scenes by the Fenians. Parnell went on a tour of Ireland where, as was recorded at the time in some guy's diary, he addressed rough and tumble meetings, half farmers, half Fenians. At one such meeting in Ulster, he declined to define the terms of independence that he favoured. That Ireland and England might live together in amity, connected only by the link of the crown, was the barest nod he would make to Isaac Butt's Home Rule programme. In the meantime, he said, the repealer, the constitutionalist, the federalist, the separatist, the Fenian, should work together on a common platform of peasant proprietorship as the only final and practical solution to the land question, that is the liquidation of landlordism. So Parnell's attracted the eye of Davitt and Devoy, Devoy, the Fenian in America, Davitt, who's now touring around Ireland. And in December 1878, John Devoy sends a telegram, proposing a cooperation with Parnell and other radical between Fenians and the radical the radical fringe of the Home Rule parliamentarians on 5 conditions. First of all, that they stop talking about Home Rule and instead talk about self-government. Self-government could mean Home Rule, self-government could also mean separation, independence. That they should commit themselves to vigorous agitation for peasant proprietorship, and in the meantime, reduction of rents against arbitrary eviction, but with the aim of liquidating landlordism. That they exclude all sectarian issues from their platform. That they undertake united and aggressive parliamentary action. That is, they act as a disloyal opposition within Westminster. And finally, that they support oppressed nationalities throughout the British Empire. Parnell famously has this cablegram read to him and apparently just kind of goes, and doesn't say anything. So Parnell doesn't commit himself to anything formally. There's no formal agreement with the Fenians. And indeed, the Fenian leadership also rejected the new departure because the Fenian leadership say, no, we don't want anything to do with electoralism and parliamentarianism. But in practice, the new departure happens. Active Fenians on the ground cooperate with the radical parliamentarians, and Parnell allows the cooperation to happen, and basically Parnell sticks to the new departure stipulations. Basically he does. It's worked out a few years ago by Patrick Maughan, an historian in Ireland, that he's proven pretty much convincingly that actually Parnell covertly and secretly in the library of Trinity College Dublin, I think, did actually take the Fenian oath, that Parnell actually became a Fenian. Though he wouldn't have felt bound by that. Parnell and democratic centralism would not have gone on. Now, John Devoy publicly defended the new departure strategy, saying that the Fenians should no longer remain as isolated conspirators, but had to enter public political life. He believed that a large body of Irish nationalists could be won over through an honourable compromise, and Devoy appealed to Fenians to come out of the rat holes of conspiracy. Snug in rat holes of conspiracy, but he says, come out of the rat holes of conspiracy and take part in the public life of the country. And the central innovation of the new departure, as I've suggested, was its appeal to material self-interest rather than purely rhetorical patriotic sentiment. Fenian leader Matthew Harris, who becomes a major organiser of the land war, explained that only by appealing to the practical concerns of the farming classes could the Land League mobilise rural Ireland beyond the limited support already achieved by Isaac Butt's Home Rule movement. Yeah, how long have you been going on?
Just 11 minutes.
Right, okay. I'll go on for another 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Devoy helped to reorganise the Fenian movement in Ireland. Interesting, his account of the Fenian movement in Ireland makes it clear by the end of the 1870s it's primarily rural. He found about 19,000 members, compared to about 12,000 enrolled in America. A much more rural in composition than it had been before. Lots of small farmers and farmers' sons. Devoid ranges for purchase of rifles to be smuggled into Ireland. Most of these end up being distributed amongst the farming classes. When he returned from another visit from America, David toured the west of Ireland and found worsening harvest failures, rising evictions and widespread rural distress. This is not the first time this had happened, but what you have now is a movement which has got a disciplined cadre from the outset. So we have a meeting, first of all, in Irishtown and then Westport in County Mayo, which is the beginning really of the land war. You can see where it begins here. The Land League of Mayo will become the Irish National Land League. It's got a big, Irish National Land League has got a big membership of the great and good and respectable in Dublin, which too many historians pay attention to. These people are basically irrelevant. The people who run the Land League, first of all the Mayo Land League and then the Irish National Land League, are all, the fundamental organisers are all Fenians or ex-Fenians. At the Westport meeting, David denounces landlords as a territorial garrison, whilst Parnell turns up to vote on behalf of the radical MPs. But it's notable what he says there. There is no use in relying upon the exertions of the Irish members of Parliament. At this point, God helps him who helps himself. So this is already set up when this catastrophic failure of harvests in 1879. And at this point, a mass social movement erupts, and we have the emergence again of the Bürgerlei. As David observes, by the end of the year, many landlords were conceding rent reductions, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but, as he said, through fear. The landlords realised that they confronted the mass upsurge of Bürgerlei intimidation unless they cut the rents. And the agrarian crisis transforms scattered tenant resistance into a national political movement. I think this is interesting. This is Parnell describing the strategy which he's bringing into the movement. So first of all, we cannot, of course, prevent all tenants from paying their rents. And there are cowards among them who have not shaken off their belief in the divine right of the landlords, but a certain amount of pressure from public opinion, which in such cases is apt to occasionally manifest itself in unpleasant ways, must be brought to bear upon those who are weak and cowardly. He's calling upon the Berkeley to do the business, the hillside men to do the business, and if people pay rent, they should be intimidated. It's not an attempt to coerce the peasantry at large, but any mass movement has got the free rider problem. What do you do about scabs? And Berkeley are to keep the scabs in line. He says, as far as I've been able to gather, Parnell knows rightly what the deal is, the Fenian organisation and its leaders are opposed, though not hostile to our movement, the reason being that it is constitutional. And that's true, formally the leadership of the Fenian movement have held aloof from the new departure. But it's interesting, a true revolutionary movement in Ireland, and note here that Parnell is describing the movement he's involved in as a revolutionary movement, not semi-revolutionary, but revolutionary. A true revolutionary movement in Ireland should, in my opinion, partake of both a constitutional and an illegal character. It should be both an open and a secret organisation, using the constitution for its own purposes, radical disloyalty, but also taking advantage of its secret combination. I don't see how you can read that and think that secretly Parnell is a super duper moderate. That's how he's read. Parnell ultimately becomes the leader of the. There's an election in 1880 which radicalises the Home Rule Party. There's a bunch of what's known as Parnellites elected. The Parnellites are those who openly identify with the mass developing peasant movement of resistance in the country. Openly identify with that. They come from a different class. They're usually editors of local newspapers, that kind of thing. And Parnell is elected leader of the Home Rule Party. In practice, actually, he's only really got a core following of about 30 MPs or less than that out of about 100 Home Rule MPs, about 30 of them are hardcore Parnellites. It's notable that they get some respectable dudes to nominate him as leader of the Home Rule Parliamentary Party, but the guy who seconds the nomination is this guy, Joseph Biggar. Joseph Biggar is a Home Rule MP. He got into the Home Rule Party as a covert Fenian. He's a Belfast publican, very strong Belfast accent. He's also a hunchback, and he led a radical disloyal opposition in a very practical way in the 1870s through sabotaging parliamentary votes, parliamentary debates. If he didn't like a parliamentary debate because it was ignoring Irish issues, he'd get up and make 7-hour-long speeches just to disrupt parliamentary action. And Parnell had first got a reputation by following Biggar's strategy. So Biggar seconding the nomination of Parnell is basically putting that imprimatur upon Parnell as this kind of radical leader of an MP, but whoever is primarily basing the strength of the movement on mass agitation in the Irish countryside. And this is a real thing. Luckily, the cops are very useful for the historian because they define agrarian outrages as a particular crime, which are broadly crimes which are connected to the Burchelei. So we get a pretty good indication of radicalisation and activism over the long period of the Land War. So you can see it in 1877, west of Ireland. So that's here. There we go, getting more intensive. Here we go, boom. You can see it's concentrating west of the. There we are, getting more and more intensive.
How do they define an outrage?
I mean, basically, it's up to the cops, you know. So it probably includes some stuff which isn't really kind of organised agrarian agitation, but it captures it pretty well. So anything from murder to burning a haystack. See the intensity. You can see it's a rural movement, primarily west of Ireland. Just gives a sense of what's happening over time. What really radicalises the movement is the House of Lords rejects the compensation for disturbances bill, which would have made it more difficult to evict peasants during the agrarian crisis, and the House of Lords rejects it. Saying, no, we're not having that, despite the fact that it had formerly had government support from Gladstone's government. Thomas Brennan basically welcomes this. He says, this is it, this is the death of landlordism in Ireland. They have hung themselves from their class selfishness. And agrarian violence, which had moonlighting Buckley activities, which had previously concentrated in Connacht, rapidly spread throughout much of Ireland. It's also a mass popular movement. It's not just illegalities. It's also there's 500 Land League meetings, probably combined attendance of more than 2 million people in the course of 1880. Notably, labourers as well as tenant farmers attend these meetings. The main cadre organising it at the provincial level are people like Matt Harris, PJ Sheridan, Michael Boyton, James O'Kelly, all Fenians or ex-Fenians, organise a discipline cadre. League orators deliberately blurred the boundary between constitutional agitation and physical force traditions. They were very careful what they said because they knew the cops were there, who were taking everything down and would convict them if they said anything which goes too far. But they were very good at the kind of language and the nod and the wink. A very common phrase was dubbing to, Irish for, you all know what I mean. So they came on to say something about saying, yeah, you know, that guy who's paying the rent, don't be too harsh on him, but, you know, make sure he knows that he should stop paying the rent. You know what I mean, dubbing to, you know, that's the kind of way they talked, you know. Or, you know, obviously I'm not for a republic immediately, or Irish separatism immediately, but you know what I mean, dubbing to, you know, that's the kind of thing they said. The Land League strategy becomes to a key point when there's a very good a harvest in the autumn of 1880. This is the point now where you need mass pressure to stop tenants paying the rent, to stop the movement falling apart. So the tenants are instructed to hold the harvest, to only pay the rent at the point of a bayonet, which means only pay the rent when you've exhausted legal avenues in order to try and to make it difficult for the landlords to convince the landlords that it's easier to just give a rent abatement. That largely works, so it doesn't become expensive for the land league. But fundamentally, the movement, I think, is kind of broadly successful. One father, another a kind of social priest who writes about this says, in the end, the land struggle breaks the heart of the Irish landlords, by which he means it breaks their will. Famously coming out of the land war, of course, is boycott, which is anybody who breaks the discipline of the Irish National Land League will be boycotted. That is, you not do business with them, you not even hail them in the street. One particular land agent is this guy. He obviously thought he was a bit of a dude. Captain Charles Boycott, and of course he gives the name. So the boycott comes from the Irish land war. In the end, he tries to keep his farm going and so on, but he's boycotted by the local, by all the traders in the localities. He won't get anybody to work for him. He has to get orange men down from Ulster to work the farm and so on. He has to get up early in the morning to do his own cows, milk his cows. His wife has to do the family chores instead of having a servant to do it. In the end, he gives up the ghost and leaves Ireland, but he becomes internationally famous, the boycott. There is, of course, coercive, fatal violence in this. This is my calculation of land war homicides and just where they happen. These do include, however, homicides also convicted by agents of landlordism in the state, though not legal executions. I don't include them in the figures. Sometimes can be very concentrated. 21 in Galway is partly because of a particular area around Lough Ray, where Lord Clanrickard was an extremely onerous landlord. Clanrickard himself was, there is something severely wrong with him. He has at least a personality disorder, if not outright insane. And he refused to make any concessions to the tenants, and it gets extremely violent around there. So it's not mass death by any means, but there are homicides in the land war. This is my point. I think if landlordism hadn't collapsed at this point, it would have happened instead in the War of Independence, and the fatalities would have been just at a different level, I think. The land war comes to a crunch. There is a Land Act, which is a major victory. It doesn't eliminate landlordism, but it's a major victory for the land movement. What it does do, however, is exclude any any tenant who's in arrears. So it's an attempt by the British state to split the peasant movement in Ireland by making concessions which can only be taken advantage of in practice by those who are paying up in their rent. Therefore abandoning the poor peasantry. The Land League responds to this with the No Rent Manifesto, a general strike against the rent. It's never quite sufficient to actually be an effective, complete general strike of rent, but it's probably more effective than historians tend to say. And what it does do is lead to what's known as the Kilmainham Treaty, because the leaders of the Land League, including Parnell at this point, are in Kilmainham prison, but through intermediaries they negotiate with the government and they come up with a new settlement which wipes out arrears of rent for the smallholders. Somebody may recognise that. To wind up, landlordism is not finally liquidated until the Wind and Land Act of 1903, I think, and then an amending act in 1909. But the land war puts it on the pathway to its end. It fundamentally makes landlordism economically dysfunctional. It takes away most of the privileges of land and property in Ireland, and in the end, landlordism becomes untenable. Interestingly, Kautsky at some point, I don't think it working quite the same way, but Kautsky draws a parallel. Kautsky says the way the revolution will happen is that you'll have a worker government all the legal privileges of the capitalists will be removed. The state will basically back strikers against the capitalists, and eventually the capitalists will say, we can't bear this anymore. Please nationalise our property, and because we don't want it anymore. It's a pain in our ass. I think it's very unlikely about how a socialist revolution will happen, but actually he's taken a direct parallel from Ireland, because in a way that is what happens in the 1903 Land Act. A lot of the landlords are basically begging to be bought out by that point by the British state, because they just can't bear it anymore, because they don't have that advantage over the peasantry, and this derives really from the land war. The radicalism is not entirely gone by this point, and indeed what you have in the Irish Free State, and to a degree also in Northern Ireland, is the continued liquidation of the remnants of landlordism, and also really quite considerable attempts to, and successful attempts at land redistribution over the decades of the Irish Free State, which only really come to an end in the 1980s. That's finally when land redistribution has more or less come to be seen as complete. So in some respects, the peasant revolution continues through the early and to now middle history of the Irish Free State. And it's worth bearing in mind that the cadre, the political elites of independent Ireland, quite often have quite close connections to this, this social strata. This is the home that De Valera grew up in. It's actually a labourer's cottage. Actually, to the end now. By the time the Irish Land Commission was wound up, had finished its process of land redistribution in 1987, it had acquired and redistributed 2.34 million acres, around 20% of Ireland's agricultural land, to 248,000 families. Also, much more successfully than modern Irish society does, De Valera's government, in particular in the 1930s, did an impressive house building for labourers and so on. It's this guy, Arthur Rosenberg. He wrote a book. He was a academic in Germany, is a founder member of the KBD. He's one of the leading KBD representatives in the Reichstag in the 1920s. Eventually breaks to the KBD, ends up being in America, I think, and writing interesting kind of academic studies, but also within a broadly Marxist framework. He did a book in 1939 called Socialism and Democracy. His comment about Ireland is interesting in that. He says, within the British Empire, because Ireland at this point is still within the British Empire, within the British Empire, a strong government influenced by ideas of social democracy exists in the Irish Free State, where President De Valera established his power on a coalition of petty farmers and workers, and energetically suppressed all fascist tendencies. But I think to a large extent, that's right. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mark, for that very interesting talk. We'll open the floor now to comments, questions, contributions. I think we have about half an hour, 35 minutes or so. So put your hands up and I'll start putting down names. I think I saw Anne first. So Anne, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, I may as well go first. So thank you very much, Mark. That was just great. I really enjoyed it. So what I wanted, just a couple of questions. So firstly, I want to ask you, can you say a little bit about how Fenianism found reflection in 1916? And the second point is that in relation to the Basque peasant movement, although they called themselves the Bukali, isn't just all men, there's plenty of women taking part in that. So while I agree with you that the land, the redistribution and those measures taken by De Valera were like radical and in keeping with the previous period, for me, there's no doubt that social issues were extremely conservative, and like, how do you explain that? You know, it doesn't seem to me that there's a connection between that and Fenianism. It seems more to be a more conservative approach, more conservative peasantry, and also because of De Valera's own beliefs. And then thirdly, about the international connections, because it seems like there's no doubt that the United States was extremely important, and the fact that they saw the need to work for the liberation of all of the colonial suppressed nations under the British Empire. Did they, I mean, I think I'm pretty sure from my memory that they did cooperate, and that there were meetings held between the Fenian leadership and other leaderships of other national movements during the period of their existence. Thank you.
Jack was next, but he's left the room for a minute, so any other takers? Mark, go ahead.
Thanks, Mark, for extremely illuminating talk. I have a couple of sort of very picky picks, one of which is intellectual nationalism arising late in 1848 with peasant nationalism earlier. But isn't intellectual nationalism in a sense already there in Annesley and Sherlock and Swift's? Annesley and Sherlock in 1719 is an attempt by the Irish Parliament, which at that time existed, to prevent appeals to the English House of Lords from the Irish courts, which seems to me to be a nationalist intervention. And Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, which is the suggestion that hunger in Ireland could be solved by selling babies for human consumption, i.e. extreme satire, but the same sense, in a certain sense, of relation with hunger. The other pick is, you said that guerrilla warfare had not yet been invented. My understanding is that the term guerrilla warfare comes from the Peninsular War in the early 1800s, so in existence as an idea by this period, but that doesn't alter the fact that what you're talking about, the Fenians, is not proposal to have what they do, you're describing is a guerrilla war. The land war is a form of low-level guerrilla war, but what the Fenian project is one big insurrection. The final thing is relates to your issue and Anne's issue about the character of de Valera's regime. This is just a to and fro about this. For me, if we think of the peasantry as a class, the peasantry as a class and the small middle class as a class generally exploits family labour. And in a sense, Mark's description of the Irish peasantry under landlordism, it's difficult for it to be an exploiting class precisely because there's so little stratification, because Irish ascendancy landlordism is so deeply exploitative. But as soon as you take the lid off that, the possibility of accumulation on a small scale for peasant farmers, or for that matter for artisan operators, begins to exist. And the question of the exploitation of the family labour of women and children becomes a political issue. And that, it seems to me, the Pethy Bridges book, Social Origins of Stalinism, and oh dear, there's other people who've written on policing in the 1920s Russia. The sense that you lift the landlord class off the backs of the peasantry, and now the character of the peasant patriarch as an exploiter surfaces, or for that matter, the artisan patriarch as an exploiter surfaces. And from that point of view, it would seem to me there's not an inconsistency between a degree of radical anti-landlordism and redistributionism. The distributionist policy carries with it, it seems to me, connection with clericalism and social conservatism. It can be distributionist and carry with it clericalism and social conservatism in the same way as, in point of fact, Proudhon, great distributionist, advocate of federalism to the point of backing the radical Catholic conservative federalists in Switzerland, in the Civil War in Switzerland, and backing the Confederacy in the United States Civil War, and strong anti-Semite. You know, it says this it seems to me contradiction in the class politics of the peasantry, which it raises issues in that discussion. That's it.
Thank you, Mike. Next we have Jack.
Yeah, apologies. I missed Anne, and I missed obviously a bit of Mike, and I'd be interested to sort of hear what Anne said, because I think I'm guessing from what Mike was saying that you had a sort of radically different take on De Valera. That's my guess. So I call of nature and apologies for that, because I got similar questions in that sense. Okay. Are the peasantry a class? My own sort of feeling about it is that you talked about nationalism by definition being cross-class, and my view of the peasantry as a class is it's a cross-class class. In the sense that precisely when it acts, it can act precisely against landlords, or it can act against foreign domination at particular moments, but as a class, it's also divided, and it has a tendency to divide. And in that sense, okay, I know it's sort of, it's definitely not representative, but I do recommend anyone who hasn't read Sholokov's novels about the Cossacks in Russia, I really do recommend it, because Mike, you were referring to the tendency of the peasant to exploit their own family, and that would also include their extended family. And I do get the feeling, okay, this is the Cossacks, so I know it is a peculiar part of Russia. But nevertheless, I don't think that what you had with the social democracy in Russia is a real grasp of the dynamics of the peasantry. You know, you have, I mean, I understand when they're talking about kulaks, middle peasants, lower peasants, but precisely, okay, from my novelistic reading of Sholokov, sometimes the labouring peasantry would be related to the Cossack. So the Cossack is exploiting their own family, and therefore the idea that you could launch class warfare within the peasantry, you know, with the lower peasantry mobilized against the top peasantry, there's a truth there, but there's also a misunderstanding of the potential solidarity of the peasantry. In other words, it's a complex question. That's really what I'm trying to grasp towards. Okay, there's a couple of questions, Mark. The compensation that the landlords got. I really want to know, was this token compensation or was it substantial compensation? In other words, if we look at the abolition of serfdom, the peasantry in Russia was burdened with a big payback. And I want to know, to what extent the British state was generous. In other words, I couldn't possibly refuse that given my revolting peasantry, and I can retire to London or wherever the hell it happens to be, and I can buy a house around here, and I can live off my coup. I want to know that. Or was it, well, here you are, and then you live somewhere more modest, okay, so I want to know that, because I don't know it. You quoted Kautsky, and I went, okay, and you said, well, this is not how you think a revolution would happen. Maybe you're right, we don't know. But your Kautsky reminded me of a certain Karl Marx speaking in, was it The Hague or Amsterdam, the only meeting of the International, or Congress, I should say, of the International. And he talked about the possibility of a peaceful revolution in Britain and I think the Netherlands. I don't think he knew much about the Netherlands, but his model, was sort of based on buying out the British capitalist class, bribing them. And in that sense, okay, there you've got a workers' state that will compensate. And I think he talks about letting them live in relatively comfortable life. I don't see what's wrong with that. To me, what he's trying to avoid is what he calls a slave owner's rebellion. And, often, if you propose that, you're saying, you're being soft on the capitalists. Actually, what we are is being soft. We're trying to avoid mass casualties on our side, because in any civil war, the capitalist class mobilizes. Very unlikely that many of them will die. Okay, they're retainers, they're troops, the people they pay for. Who suffers in a civil war? It will be the common people. It will also be the commonwealth of the people. So from our point of view, if we can avoid a civil war, if we can avoid violence, we can have the threat of violence, that's one thing. But if we can avoid actual war, that's a great thing. That isn't being soft. And we did have a debate here last year, and we had it out in the Weekly Worker with Nick Rack and his fellow thinkers, who wanted to nationalise everything, including every fish and chip shop, the day after the revolution, because we can't possibly have anyone who's exploited. So in a fish and chip shop, presumably your wife or your son or your daughter, whatever it is, we cannot tolerate that. What you get with Marx, on the other hand, is that the talk, you have a revolution, whatever that looks like, whatever that is, it's a parliamentary majority perhaps, backed by force, backed by a popular militia, that then gradually expropriates, the property classes. So in that sense, I haven't read Kautsky on that, so I'm sort of saying at least the approach of Kautsky is something that we should defend, think about, without making it into we can't possibly do this. We should be prepared to fight a civil war if necessary, but it's not something we actually want. It's not something we desire. Okay, lastly, I love the description of our, can't remember his name, it was a Stein, I presume he's Jewish, the German comrade that goes to America.
Oh, Rosenberg, yeah.
Rosenberg, there you are, not Stein, a Berg, okay. I want a little bit of, because I missed Dan, I want a little bit of an elaboration. Influenced by social democracy, maybe when it came to building houses, okay, but in terms of the social programme, I mean, I haven't heard what you said, Anne, but to me, what you've got is a theocracy in, I call it the Free State, Southern Ireland, call it whatever you will. Is that influenced by social democracy? I don't think so. So I think you can get, you could look, for example, at fascist Italy, and you could say, oh, that's influenced by social democracy, and clearly it is on one level, but it's also clearly the opposite. It's the polar opposite of social democracy. So, yeah, if again, I'm not educated in this, but if you ask me, was there a parallel with Salazar's Portugal, without knowing much about Salazar's Portugal and without knowing that much about De Valera's Ireland, I go, yes-ish. That would be my answer on that one.
Okay, thank you, Jack. I've got to read out a quick contribution from a comrade online and then I'll move to you. Has the speaker
Can you speak up a little bit?
Sorry. Has the speaker studied the work of the Land Commission in the Republic? Access to its archives are strongly restricted. In the early 20th century, Ireland, rural workers were a significant social grouping. The late Bob Purdy made...
Tell me what you're saying.
The late Bob Purdy made much of the influence of distributism on Republican ideology, down to Rix Johnson, inspired by Erinua. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. There's so much about this. I'll try and be very brief because you could go on for days. There's so many aspects. I think one thing to bear in mind is the sheer scale and the time, because the land holdings that the landholders had were huge, going into the thousands of acres. And in terms of the economics that followed by up to and including De Valera's time, he sort of had a vision in his mind, a kind of an ideal cut-off point for what could be vibrant agriculture, about 35 acres. And, a lot of the farms were still smaller than that at that time. Now, subsequent to that, economists and conservative economists and others would argue that, De Valera was being optimistic that you could have vibrant farms even then that would have enough money for investment, improvement, modern agriculture and so forth. So while there was a delay, it's really only now in Irish agriculture that you're getting around to the idea of, well, in this day and time, you're talking about 120 acres or so forth as being seen as the successful farmers today. And there are people who came from their ancestry were from small holdings. I suppose the thing to say about the culture is that even today, there is that echo in the genes, I suppose, in Ireland, even bourgeois, petty bourgeois, upwardly mobile farmers, people from rural areas. It is this memory that it was the best thing that ever happened in Irish history. And there were so many aspects to it. You even see the fact of, a few, not all, but a few of the priests got involved in supporting this, and some professionals even, and there's some famous photographs taken of RIC people following around some of these individuals and shadowing them and so forth to get information. Even in literature, there's, for instance, Peg Sayers, who was a famous storyteller, which they collected folklore from her, wrote her life story, very simple, being poor in the Blastic Islands, and her husband was a small fisherman. But the interesting thing about her life story is she only gets into politics once. She never mentions the 1860s Fenians, she never mentions the First World War, she never mentions the Boer War, things like that. The only thing she goes into in depth is the Land League, and she goes in to talk about that, about what they used to call the plan of campaign. And just, I suppose, getting back to the previous speaker, just W.T. Cosgrave, who was there between independence and when De Valera came back to power in 1933, one of the key things was that they completely copied the Westminster system. So you had this friction, parties sort of acting out the constitutional situation. So social democracy didn't take off. You had two similar parties, but the W.T. Cosgrave idea was that you sewed in the continuation of basically the same type of judicial system, the same parliamentary procedures and all that. So that was there by the time De Valera did get back in. One of the unintended things as well, culturally, the whole thing of the priest-ridden society, the conservative and social issues. It was an unintended consequence because a lot of the absentee landlords and a lot of the heirs to big estates, a lot of them were living in London and living kind of bohemian lifestyles, and it was this idea that, they were corrupting, and the idea that, if somebody had to emigrate, for instance, young girls would go into, social service as servants and stuff like that, that they couldn't be safe with a lot of these, playboy kind of landlords who lived in had nice properties in London, townhouses and stuff, and that memory was a contributing factor to the peasants. I'm not going to go into it now, but you could give a whole session on the relationship between David and Parnell. They had a very complicated relationship, and if you want to go into more radical side of things, you could give a big whole section to Michael David as well. Thanks.
Thank you, comrade. Do we have any other contributions, questions? I might come in very quickly there on, I think what was said earlier about the way Okay.
Maybe taking your hand.
Maybe people can hear me now, hopefully. To come in very quickly on Éamon de Valera's regime and the Fianna Fáil party in that period. There was obviously, in the 1920s, Fianna Fáil was slightly constitutionally disloyal by refusing to take the oath and having, by comparison, fairly radical things in its programme, like nationalisation of certain industries, abolition of all banks, replacing it all with cooperative banks and so on. And I mean, in the 1932 elections, some of them entered Parliament with guns, thinking they'd have to shoot their way into assuming government. But I would question the idea that Fianna Fáil in this period was analogous to social democracy elsewhere in Europe, and I think it will be another interesting thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is the relationship between republicanism and nationalism, right? I mean, obviously they're seen as synonymous, like many in Ireland and many outside Ireland as well, but I mean, I would argue that they aren't entirely synonymous, right? I mean, we have nationalist parties in Ireland that are not really Republican. Of course, republicanism has always had a kind of a much more socially radical, even socialist element to it. During the Irish War of Independence, you had the likes of Liam Mellows, who, while certainly not Marxist or really communist, but certainly socialist of some kind. And of course, you had a workers' party, Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party, that emerged out of the dissident Republican movement in the mid to late 20th century. So I think that would be an interesting thing to comment on.
Thanks to everyone. Lots of great points there as ever. Was in Anne's points, and come with some other people, but the nature of kind of De Valera's Ireland, somewhat like Tony Cliff's Lenin, I kind of would like to bend the stick in this a bit because it's become such a kind of, look at De Valera's Ireland, it's a priest-ridden theocracy. You can hardly see any rainbow lanyards there at all. It's so frightful, and I think whilst this is true, Ireland is somewhat more conservative in its social mores compared to other societies. To some extent, partly it's because the resources of the state, Ireland's just radically more poorer than Britain, and a great deal of what the state is doing in terms of social provision in Britain is being done basically for free by the Catholic Church in large parts of Ireland, It's not the best way to organise these things, though I do have a feeling that the clergy and the nuns and so on get a rather hard time now for an awful lot of work they did for very little, which otherwise I think wouldn't have got done at all, you know. But my main point would be is that what developers Ireland in particular in the 1930s, some kind of most radical phase, does tend in the direction towards a kind of an electoral and social alliance between the small farmer and the urban working class that is fundamentally Fianna Fáil's constituency in the 1930s. Electoral constituency, something that they do attend to. There are notable divisions. There is a fascist movement which is not inconsiderable in Ireland. The blue shirts, they tend to be focused on the larger farmers, so they get a bit of the graziers and the kind of hangers on to the graziers and so on. But the small farmers stick to Fianna Fáil. You know, those who kind of fought the land war generally stick with Fianna Fáil and all of that. The two things that, I mean, they introduced a minimum wage for agricultural labourers, and this is still uncommon. Unemployment assistance and the Land Act of Agricultural Wages Act of 36 introduces statutory minimum wages, maximum working hours and paid holidays for agricultural labourers. You can say, well, that's not a big deal, you know. The only other countries in the world which had that at the time was the United Kingdom, Australia and New Zealand. All three of them immeasurably richer than Ireland. United States does not introduce similar legislation until 1938. 2 years later, France doesn't do it until 1950. You know, this is a state which makes considerable efforts to maintain the smallholder agricultural labourer kind of coalition. They also do direct resources. I mean, it's from a very low basis, but there is it has been calculated that the expansion of Irish industry in terms of employment is roughly equivalent to what happens in Russia in the 1930s, you know, because of direction of capital through tariffs and so on. So it's a serious attempt and quite substantial, successful attempt, I think, to solder together an alliance, you know. And I think that needs to be paid attention to, as well as social issues. I don't really buy the theocracy thing, you know. I mean, there is in these islands a country with an established church where the head of state has to be a member of a particular church, and that's the United Kingdom, it's not Ireland, you know. Ireland early on, the head of state is Jewish, you know. The church has a special place in the Irish constitution that's removed in 1971, I think. But other churches are acknowledged in the Irish constitution of 36, including notably the Jewish congregations, which is not a very fashionable thing to say in the middle of the 1930s, you know. De Valera is always kind of skillful with the church, you know, because he'd been on the irregular side, as they were called, in the Irish Civil War, and had been, you know, they'd been excommunicated, you know. So he's a devout Catholic, but he's also kind of skillful in the relations with them. You can't piss them off too much because they do an awful lot of social work, which basically the state doesn't have the resources to do in the 1930s. You can't annoy them too much. He's a genuine Catholic for sure, you know, but he's quite careful to not go down the line of Orthodox Catholic social teaching. An Orthodox Catholic social teaching is very clear. It's called possibilism in the 1930s. Orthodox Catholic social teaching in the 1930s is when you are in a minority, if Catholics are in a minority, you are in favour of religious liberty. If you're the majority, you're not. That's a position in the Catholic Church, you know, because you can't permit souls to go to hell, you know, so you've got the authority to impose religious uniformity, then you're obliged to do that. And Ireland doesn't do that. And it's partly so I would resist the theocracy kind of description of it, you know, and I would point to a kind of worker small farmer alliance. Social democracy might be pushing it, but I think it's maybe comparable to 1930s Mexico, might be a better comparator actually, you know, which also notably too does come out of a revolution itself. Mexico is an interesting comparison there. What kind of compensation do the landlords get? Yeah, pretty good compensation, paid up upfront by the English Treasury. That's one of the reasons why it takes so long to happen. The Irish peasantry are supposed to pay back the English treasury. Their annuities are like 30 to 40% below the rents they were paying, and already those peasants, those rents have been much reduced through a couple of decades of class struggle. So it's a big reduction already, and the rents turned into annuities. The landlords get the money up front. People like Parnell had kind of hoped that, well, liquidate landlordism, compensate the landlords will keep their domain farms, and they'll invest in their money in these domain farms, they'll make model farms, they'll start local industries, they can start behaving like a proper capital providing upper class. That's what they should be doing. It's not what happens. They just piss it away in Monte Cassino and places like that, you know. It's just hopeless. They're hopeless, you know. So it goes nowhere, that money. What happens to the annuities? Well, eventually, by the time, the first thing the De Valera government says is that we're not paying the annuities anymore. You can sing for it, you're not getting it. You know, he doesn't abolish. He reduces the annuities, but he doesn't abolish them. Instead, they're effectively nationalised. They become the fund which is used to redistribute land until under this land commission until 1987, when it's finally wiped up. So, in essence, in a very mild way, land is actually nationalised in Ireland, because that's kind of what land nationalisation is, you know. Britain is not happy about these annuities not being paid. This is not what they'd agreed to, and therefore you have what's called the economic war, which is basically a tariff war between Britain and Ireland, which in effect Ireland wins that eventually, because they come to an agreement. Part of the agreement is that the British military presence, which is left, residual British military presence in Ireland, south of Ireland, is withdrawn, which otherwise would have made Irish neutrality impossible. So the British military presence and the treaty ports is withdrawn. In effect, Britain comes to accept the 1936 Constitution, which more or less removes the Crown from the Irish Constitution. And there's some kind of, Ireland pays £10 million or something to wipe out everything, and that's massively less than what is technically owed. You know, what happens to the Irish land elite? It mostly sold off, actually. Mostly leave. A number of the big houses are burnt by the anti-treaty IRA in the War of Independence. So there's a bit of revenge going on, as well as military calculations. If you go into the big houses which are left in Ireland and you look around them, you know, as a tourist, you know, you think, God, it's very bare in here. There's hardly anything in here. Was it all burnt out? And he says, no. It's just the landlord. They just took everything out and brought it in England. It's in Brighton now. You know, they just strip these houses and leave bare walls. You know, the economic argument in favour of landlordism is that it encourages efficiency. Because the problem is, if you've no rent, then you can sit in your farm forever, doing very little with it, being happy with bare subsistence or a little above, and you get inefficiency, you get agricultural inefficiency. So the bare argument for paying a rent is that it forces efficiency in the farmers. If you can't afford to rent, a more efficient farmer will take over from you. You know. But actually, we can see no negative impact from the disappearance of landlordism. I think this is partly actually because the state intervenes to raise agricultural wages, and that's where the pressure comes in on the farmer, improves agricultural wages, minimum wage, minimum conditions, and that forces agricultural efficiency. I think we need to be a bit careful about being too disparaging. I know I also like the bit which is, you all know it here, you know, where is it? Anyway, it's from the 1881 programme Parti ouvrier, which was the preamble, which Marx writes. It begins, there's only two ways by which the producer can be free. One is owning the means by which they live, the other is socialism. You know. But there's still modes of freedom. Being a small farmer is a mode of freedom. You know. It may not be, in the long run, tenable under capitalist conditions, but I think it can be very easy to be excessively critical. It's weird, some of the historiography you get now. There's endless pity for the landlords, and you know how nobody appreciated them. You know, and there's this idea that all the small farmer business is such a waste of time. let's just get on to agribusiness, industrial agriculture, Loch Ness is green now because of algae bloom, I mean, it ruins, industrial agriculture ruins the countryside, so it's not a clear advantage that we've finally broken out a small farmer economy in Ireland, With capitalism, it's going to happen, for sure, but there was a mode of limited liberation, but it was a liberation, and it's one which is not entirely oppressive of, at least in the 1930s, it's not entirely oppressive of the working classes. There is that coalition, I would argue, Plenty of downsides about David R's Ireland, and I don't want to denigrate that side of it, but I want to bend the stick. Comrade Cliff would advise me to. Of course, I should have mentioned, had I not run out of time, the Ladies' Land League. One point which happens in the Irish Land War is that the government arrests the leadership cadre. All these Fenians I talked about, they're all in prison, they're all interned. And so during the most radical phase of the land movement, which is the No Rent Manifesto, on the one hand, the Burkhalai, the unknown Burkhalai, just take over in the localities, and they do everything. Insofar as there is a national organisation, it's the Ladies' Land League, because they haven't arrested them, so they take over and run the most radical phase. Ladies' Land League, nationally, they're pretty middle class, but also women peasants are very important. They don't seem to do raiding very much. I suspect they're very important in targeting. I think they're very important in targeting. They help target who's going to be taken out, as it were, So, but Burkhalai obviously does have a gendered aspect to it, but we probably shouldn't read too much into that. It's just like I remember a friend of mine referring to a group of people in Oxford said, "Right, come on, guys, let's go home," and somebody objecting, saying that's sexist. Guys in Northern Ireland at least just means people. It doesn't mean it's not gender specific. So I think Burkhalai probably had an element of that connotation too. Lads, okay, Mike's picky points, always like them. I agree. I mean, what used to be, so you get Swift and people like that, and Molyneux and all the rest of it. This is what historians used to call colonial nationalism, which is, they don't use that term anymore because it's seen as a bit unfashionable, because it's maybe derogatory. But most of that kind of nationalism, they talk about the Irish nation all the time. What they mean is the Irish Protestants. That's what they mean with Irish nation, Even Swift, even when he's writing a modest proposal, he's not, he doesn't see himself as a representative of Catholic people. What does happen later on is that there's a choice to be made. You can get real independence from Britain if you start appealing to the great Catholic masses, and that's where the divide comes in. And of course, the most radical element of the colonial nationalists will become United Irishmen. But there's a choice to be made, and think, do you treat the masses as simply tenants of the nation? I kind of use that term in the book, and I take that from Otto Meyer, actually. There's a kind of nationalism which is an exclusive, historic nationalism, which is actually, it's not for the masses, it's for the real nation, which is a Protestant Ireland in the Irish context, or there's actually existing Irish people. In a way, I think popular nationalism, Catholic nationalism, defenders and so on, are prepared to countenance a class collaboration with colonial nationalism if it defeats the ancient enemy, the Saxon, basically. They look around, as I say. I think nationalism. I think it's complicated that, but as a summary, but I think the class collaboration element of Irish nationalism is significant. On guerrilla warfare, I made that point a little bit clearer in the book, which is I mean guerrilla warfare as the main military effort. Of course, the difference in the Peninsular War is that guerrilla warfare is ancillary to Wellington's conventional forces. So guerrilla warfare had been theorised, particularly in the British Army actually, as something which may be used as ancillary to the main effort. The Irish War of Independence, I think, basically invents or discovers guerrilla warfare as the characteristic form of national liberation, in that it's all guerrilla warfare, plus popular movements, but you don't have a conventional force. Hobsbawm makes the point, he says, actually Ireland kind of invents national liberation mode of struggle, but he says it's decades before everybody else takes it up. Perry Anderson made the point in his little book about India. He said, big mistake with the Indians, they should have done the same in India in the 1920s, where in fact it's much better conditions for fighting a guerrilla war, and you could have chucked the Brits out no problem in the 1920s if you'd gone down that path, but instead they do Gandhiism instead. So I don't know. Exploitation of family labour, I think it's right, though I think it's complicated in Ireland. I think part of so you do get that peasant is patrimonial, exploits family labour. I think all that happens. It is notable, though, I think partly because there isn't much of a sexual division of labour, certainly before the famine, but even to a degree afterwards. Anybody can kind of use a spade and dig up potatoes. You know, there seems to be less of a sexual division of labour than is often the case in peasant economies in Ireland, and less the woman, it seems to me, is much more authority in the peasant family than is characteristic. Certainly before the famine, or like even thereafter. I know it's kind of controversial to say now, but I think it's the case actually. One guy talking early 19th century says the Irish peasant family is like the perfect little republic. He says it's a kind of joke, but what he means, men, women and pig. That is, the guy who pays the rent are on an equal level, and he's making a joke about it. He says this is why the Irish peasants are so open to Jacobin republicanism, because it's kind of in the nature of the family structure. That could be an exaggeration. I think it's an exaggeration based on something actually. Right, sorry. I think I talked about Jack, lots of good points, but I think I talked a bit about theocracy and a bit about compensation. Online point, have I studied the work of the Land Commission? No, I haven't, no. Which covers the 20th century, and I doubt I would get round to it. They seem quite tactical, and I'm less interested in the stuff that happens after all the exciting kind of land war stuff. But I think it would be important. Insofar as Sinn Féin is the social programme, during the War of Independence, it is kind of cooperativism, actually, distributivism and cooperativism, which you can find on the left. James Connolly talks about this kind of stuff. You can find on the Catholic kind of social thinking end, you know, but cooperativism is a real thing in Ireland. In terms of republicanism, one thing that's worth remembering about republicanism, and I can see the point, but there's limits to that recent book about Marx as really a Republican. I think what you have to remember about republicanism in the 19th century is that it's not primarily about whether you have a king or not. You know, it's not even primarily about democracy. It's primarily about the independent status of the citizen. So republicanism is strongly identified with the independent producing citizen, the craftsman or the farmer. You know, it's Jeffersonian in that regard. You know, so in that sense, the land war, insofar as it has a social ideology, it does have social republicanism. Is an important part of that. It's a recent book by a guy who's written about this very well. Georgism and ideologies like that. But there is a reaction to that kind of classical republicanism amongst those who I think includes Marx, who says, in fact, petty commodity production is not viable in the long run for the great mass of people. Therefore, classical republicanism is not viable. So I'm a bit less inclined to completely put Marx into the Republican box, actually, than that recent book suggests. I think that probably covered most of the points that came up, and I just apologise for any fantastic points that I haven't taken up.
Back at 1 p.m.
Anything for some offensive view